Alright, so we're going to pick up now with our third section on organization and animal systems with muscle tissue. So obviously muscles are critical in allowing vertebrate bodies to move, looking at skeletal muscle, moving the body itself. When you think skeletal muscle, think about the muscles that physically make your skeleton move, the muscles attached to your bones, for example. But also smooth muscle, which is involved in involuntary actions like digestion, labor and delivery, childbirth, vasoconstriction, vasodilation, those kinds of things. That's going to be controlled primarily by smooth muscle. And of course, cardiac muscle, which is involved in heartbeat. So we're talking about movement with all of these things. Now, when we look at the different kinds of muscles and their overall kind of structure and anatomy, both skeletal and cardiac muscle are what we call striated muscle, meaning that if you look at sections of these muscle tissues under a microscope, you're actually going to see lines, or striations, where certain conditions are met and when the muscle takes on a certain appearance because of those conditions. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, is non-striated muscle. You do not see those lines or striations or stripes like you would with the other two. In terms of what you can control voluntarily versus involuntarily, only skeletal muscle is a voluntary muscle. The other two types, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, are both involuntary muscles, and you do not and cannot control them consciously just by thinking about it. Alright, so smooth muscle, again, we find smooth muscle in the visceral organs, like the intestines, in the stomach, those kinds of places. We also see it in the walls of blood vessels, so we can have blood vessels dilate and constrict, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, for example, because of smooth muscle located especially in the arteries and arterioles. Smooth muscle is kind of known for smooth, relatively slow, and sustained contractions, like when you're moving the remnants of your last meal along your digestive tract. Skeletal muscle, on the other hand, is striated. It's voluntary. Typically, you see connections between muscle and bone through tendons, like we talked about back in the last section of lecture. In some cases, you can have muscle attached directly to the periosteal layer of the bone, the outer layer of the bone directly. But more typically, we're going to see connection via tendons between muscle and bone. The end result of this is, of course, movement. Skeletal muscle is made up of very, very long multinucleate cells. So because they're so big, they're going to have multiple nuclei to allow them to function more efficiently. Relatively large cells, actually. When we talk about muscle fibers, the term muscle fiber, like we see over here in this picture, is synonymous with muscle cell. A muscle fiber and a muscle cell are effectively the same thing. But one thing that we're going to see here is once we look at the skeletal muscles themselves, they are extremely complex little structures. We have a relatively zoomed out view of a muscle here. We see collections of muscle fibers grouped together into what we call fascicles. But even within each one of these muscle fibers, there are also many, many, many subunits. We'll see myofibrils, we'll see myofilaments, we'll see all the little connections that make these things work, especially once we get into our chapter on the musculoskeletal system. All right, so we talked about striations before. These darkish lines here are the striations we were talking about. Each one of these larger overall structures is a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And what you can tell here is they're made up out of proteins that take on this alternating band sort of appearance. And those are the striations we were talking about a second ago. The cardiac muscle is also striated. We can see little lines here on this picture. We see a line going there, we see one going here, we see one down here, and a couple over here, up here as well. These are different kinds of striations. These are actually the result of gap junctions, or the formation of gap junctions, what we would call intercalated discs in the case of cardiac cells. Intercalated discs are these connections or lines or striations that we see on the cardiac cells. Cardiac cells tend not to be as long and skinny as skeletal muscle cells are. Instead, they tend to be more branching, like a Y shape or something like that. Each one of these also has its own single individual nucleus. We talked about the intercalated discs as well. These connections between cardiac cells allow these cardiac cells to talk to each other. They communicate very quickly back and forth because of the gaps in between the cells. They're able to transmit information relatively quickly. Gap junctions, like we said before, they are ways for cells to communicate as efficiently as possible. The overall effect, or the firing of a cardiac cell, needs to be pretty much in sync with all the other cells that come after it and all the other cells that come before it. So you want your heart to contract as one single functional unit, more or less. So it's absolutely critical that the information that's transmitted from one cell to the next, to the next, to the next, do so in a relatively fast manner. All right, so those are our three different muscle types. We're going to get back into especially skeletal muscle in our chapter on the musculoskeletal system, so we're not going to talk too much more about it now. We will also see cardiac muscle in our discussion of circulatory system and smooth muscle, primarily when we talk about circulation and digestion. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to move on and talk about nerve tissue, talk about neurons and kind of how the nervous system does what it does inside the body. So with nerve tissues, we have not only the neurons, not only the nerve cells themselves, but also these other supporting cells called glial cells. These cells here that make up what amount to a sheath around this axon are also part of the nerve tissue. Now, nervous tissue is primarily meant for communication. Right? It's electrical communication throughout the body using nervous cells. The glial cells are more like an insulator, so what they're doing is they are surrounding and protecting the transmitting part of the neuron by surrounding it. Now, neurons typically consist of three different parts. There's a large cell body kind of up here. The cell body actually contains the nucleus. It's the biggest part by volume of the cell. We also have dendrites up here. Dendrites are the receivers of the neuron. They are the ones that are getting information from the outside environment, passing it to the cell body, and from there transmitting that out to either another neuron, perhaps a muscle cell that's going to terminate at the ends of these axons out here at the end. So from dendrite to cell body to axon, those are the three parts of a typical neuron. Information comes in, information is processed in the cell body, and information is transmitted perhaps down the axon off to whatever cell is waiting next in line. So that's kind of the overall pattern or pathway of nerve transmission from or throughout the entire neuron itself. Now the nervous system, on the other hand, is divided up into two very, very large parts. We have a central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. The central nervous system primarily is made up of what we call association neurons or interpretive neurons that are taking information from all over the body, processing it, and determining whether or not something needs to happen as a result. The peripheral nervous system, on the other hand, is everything outside the brain and spinal cord. So with this, we have sensory neurons that are picking up all different kinds of sensory stimuli, from heat and cold and pain and all those sorts of things, but also motor neurons, which are causing changes to occur in the body. So motor neurons can allow muscles to fire, can allow endocrine glands to release hormones. All those kinds of things can result from the activity of the peripheral nervous system. We also talk about nerves and ganglia. So nerves are collections of axons. If you think about maybe at the back of a computer or the back of a TV or entertainment center, how you have all those wires coming out of various things, and if you bind those wires together into groups, that's more or less what a nerve is. It's a group of bound together axons that are sort of held together for organization because they're all running toward the same location. Ganglia is kind of a similar story, except with ganglia, it's not the axons that are held together, it's cell bodies that are kind of grouped together to allow them to communicate more efficiently as well. So the peripheral nervous system is getting information, passing it off to the CNS, and once the CNS decides whether or not something needs to happen, CNS can then tell motor neurons, which are again part of the peripheral nervous system, what type of activity they might need to undertake or not. Maybe they don't need to respond to a stimulus. So those are nervous tissues. We can look at sensory neurons, like we talked about, picking up information, sensory stimuli. Motor neurons causing changes in the position or activity of the body. And interneurons, which occur in between these two, that allow for processing of information and decision-making about whether or not some type of response needs to occur. So from there we have organ systems, and what I've done here for these next couple of slides is I've divided up organ systems based on their function. And so if we look at the types of organ systems that might be involved with communication and integration of information, we would be looking at the sensory systems, we'd be looking at the nervous system, and we'd also be looking at the endocrine system. So those three are involved with either picking up sensory stimuli or communicating it somewhere else in the body. Sensory system, nervous system, and endocrine system. If we look at the two organ systems responsible for movement and support, we'd be looking at the muscular system and the skeletal system, which collectively sometimes we just call the musculoskeletal system. Okay, so that's our fourth and fifth organ systems would be there. We can also look at the organ systems involved in regulation and maintenance. Here we've got four different systems. We have the circulatory, we have the respiratory, we have the digestive, and we have the urinary system. There's four of them that are all involved in maintaining homeostasis somehow in the body, whether it's nutrients, whether it's gases, whether it's water balance or pH. We've got urinary, digestive, circulatory, and respiratory systems involved with regulation and maintenance. If we look at defensive systems, we can think about two systems there involved. We can think about the immune system and also the integumentary system. The skin is also an organ that's a very instrumental barrier in keeping things out of the body that maybe shouldn't be in the body or things that we don't want in the body. The defensive system's there. And then finally, we also have reproduction and development, which would be the reproductive system. Vertebrates are one of the rare organisms where the female reproductive tract is actually involved in maintaining the developing embryo and fetus until it's time for childbirth. Not only is our reproductive system valuable for reproduction, it's also invaluable for gestation, at least for the female reproductive system. So that's kind of a unique thing that some vertebrates have, not even all vertebrates, but some vertebrates have it. Mammals certainly do. There are some reptiles. There's a few fishes and amphibians that do it as well, but for the most part, it's just mammals that do live birth, and because of that, the female reproductive tract is involved with gestation. So those are the organ systems we're going to be dealing with. We'll talk about nervous system, endocrine, skeletal, muscular, digestive, lymphatic, and immune system, maybe a little bit less than the others, but we'll see most of those throughout the rest of the course of this class. The last section in this chapter is on homeostasis. And so because this section is a fairly big one and because there's kind of a lot to it, I'm actually going to cut this section off now. I realize this section's a bit shorter than what we're accustomed to. I've only got about 10 or 10 and a half minutes into this one, but I'm going to cut it off here so our last section isn't too long. Maybe.